Hello again, this is Rabbi Dr. Juan Bejarano Gutierrez, and we're continuing our discussion on interesting differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. In our previous video, we laid out some basic geographical differences between Jews in the Iberian Peninsula and in the lands that we designate as Ashkenaz, generally France and Germany, although today we're going to be expanding that to include Poland because we're going to be referencing or referring to Rabbi Moses Isserles, the Rema. One of the things that we should say, just as a point of review, is that in the Iberian Peninsula, of course, Jews were not the only minority. We had Jews, we had Christians, we had Muslims. Muslims were a minority, but they formed the dominant power, at least for several centuries. And even though the Reconquista, the reconquest, or the Christian reconquest of the peninsula occurred over time, thereby diminishing the amount of control that the Muslims had, the very fact that Jews were not the only minority was of great advantage to the Jewish community. Even though Christians maintained the population majority, or the majority of the population at that time, the very fact that Muslims were in control was beneficial to the Jewish community. Now, it's important to note that sometimes scholars and writers and authors in particular have a tendency to describe this period as some kind of idyllic paradise. And I think that they do so because, they use the term convivencia, this interaction that took place between Jews, Christians, and Muslims academically, intellectually, economically, especially with the translation of text and the influence of philosophy, poetry, grammar, all these things that happen, which I would certainly believe were positive influences on the Jewish community. But I think it's important for us to remember that there were periods of violence, there were periods of discrimination, there were periods of the hierarchy in Islam being enforced on the Jewish and Christian communities. And even though Jews in general had a much more, one might say, stable existence throughout this period of Islamic dominance, we also have to remember the times of Islamic persecution. For example, highlighting the flight of the Rambam when he was a child, a young boy from Cordoba, because of the Almohades and the persecution that they wrought in the areas that they controlled. We also saw that during the Almovarids and during different periods of Jewish history in North Africa and in the Iberian Peninsula. So it's important for us to sort of, take into consideration that history is nuanced. There's always a little bit more complications, or it's a little bit more complex, I should say, than what we have a tendency to imagine. The same is true when we come to Ashkenaz, and that is to say that sometimes we focus in on the persecutions, the massacres that occurred during the Crusades in the Rhineland, and we focus in on that as terrible as that was, but we lose sight of the fact that there were times when life was peaceful, that there were peaceful interactions between Christians and Jews. And we find reference to this in the work of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, who in his Sefer Hasidim talks about the positive relationships between Jews and Christians. And I think that's extremely important. One of the things that he mentions is that there might be a Jew praying for his non-Jewish neighbor, wishing them well, giving them advice, even giving them moral guidance on a particular or potential sin. And we can see how Christians would have done the same in many cases. And so even though life in Christian lands was much more difficult when compared to the Iberian experience, we always have to also consider that on a daily basis, individual relationships could be much better than we generally tend to characterize. Because one of the concerns I have is that we oftentimes adopt a lachrymose view of history, that Jewish existence is only suffering. And that's important to note that, yes, there were times of suffering, there were times of persecution, but there were also times of progress and intimacy that occurred on a positive level. And I think that's something that we should always keep in mind. Now, today, one of the things that we're going to look at is the issue of wine. And the reason that this is important is because economics often explain differences between Jewish communities. The Talmud, the Bavli, as well as the Yerushalmi, note the prohibition on using wine that has been either used as a libation to an idol or handled by idol worshippers. In fact, you're not supposed to even derive benefit from it because of the concern that they may have used it in some kind of religious practice. And of course, this gets into the discussion of the status of Christianity in the medieval rabbinic mind. It's not really until the Renaissance period where we find rabbis in the Italian peninsula that have sort of a reconsideration of the standard view. But that's a topic for another time. In this particular case, what we want to focus in on is the discussion that's laid out in the glosses to something called the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the Code of Jewish Law. It's the prepared table. It's the great work of Rabbi Joseph Caro, a Spanish exile, as a boy, who left Spain in 1492 and then eventually settled in the land of Israel. He writes the Beit Yosef. He writes the Shulchan Aruch. And this Code of Jewish Law comes into the hands of Rabbi Moses Israelis, who's called the Rema. And the Rema basically says, this is wonderful things, wonderful stuff, but we need to, modify it and adapt it to include the minchagim, the perspectives of Ashkenazim. And so what he does is he creates something called the mappa, the tablecloth, and he writes his glosses and his emendations and his, changes that he notes as applicable to Ashkenazi communities. And one of the things that he writes is about this issue of wine handled by non-Jews. And he says, and this is commenting on a section in Yoredeya in the Shulchan Aruch, he says, since libation is not usual nowadays, some say that our wine touched by a non-Jew is prohibited only as far as drinking it is concerned, but one may have a benefit from it, and the same the same applies to Satam Yanam, the case of wine not definitively known to have been dedicated to an idol. Because of this, it is allowed to take their wine as repayment of a debt, since it is regarded as rescue from their hands. Similarly, whenever a loss of money is imminent, if one hasn't already bought it, b'diavad, after the fact, one may have benefit from it, although one should not intentionally deal in it in the first instant, lechatchila. Some even permit this as well, but it is better to be scrupulous. And so economics form a critical consideration for the ruling of the Rema. Now, it's interesting because in the Iberian Peninsula, we have a different circumstance, and one of the elements that's brought out in halachic teshuvot and rabbinic responsa is the status of anusim, forced converts to Christianity, and cases in which wine is entrusted to them. Can a Jew trust the testimony of an anus, an individual who has been forced to convert to Christianity, if wine has been left in their possession? But there, the consideration is somewhat different, because the issue does not have to do with the standing of the individual per se, that is to say, the Jewishness of the anus or the converso, but rather the ability of this individual to truly stop or forestall the involvement of a non-Jew who comes into the warehouse or comes into their home where they may be holding this wine for an openly practicing Jew. Why is this a critical difference? Because in that particular case, the anus may trigger the investigation of what? Of the Inquisition, of the local bishop, of an investigation that, of course, will put them in a very difficult position because they are legally Christians after their conversion. So in the case of Ashkenaz and the overwhelming issue that Rabbi Moses Israelis deals with is the financial loss that may be incurred. And in the case of the Iberian Peninsula, there's an issue that is different, and that's the status of the individual who may be in possession of the wine. But it's not so much the issue of the financial loss that may be incurred, because apparently not as many Jews were involved in that business as were in Ashkenaz. And I apologize for my voice.